The entries stretched back 7 years now, each one more troubling than the last. Blue eyes, blonde hair, fair skin that darkened only slightly as the children grew, all born to enslaved women across 3 parishes in Louisiana. All different mothers, all bearing children who looked nothing like their mothers, nothing like their recorded fathers, nothing like anyone else in the quarters. And the whispers had started. Whispers that traveled from plantation to plantation along the Mississippi River, carried by traders and runaways, by house servants who overheard their masters' worried conversations, by midwives who had delivered these strange babies and felt their blood run cold because someone was fathering these children, someone who moved unseen, someone who left no trace except the evidence written in the faces of infants who should not exist. Before we continue with the story of Louisiana's most disturbing secret, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And I want to hear from you. Leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. The mystery would consume 7 years, destroy families, end lives, and reveal a truth so calculated and cruel that even hardened plantation owners would struggle to comprehend it. But in 1837, when the first of these children was born, no one yet understood what they were witnessing. What began as a single anomaly would become a pattern so disturbing that it would shake the foundations of Louisiana's plantation society, expose the darkest corners of a system built on human bondage, and reveal how power could be wielded with absolute impunity when the law itself was designed to protect the perpetrator. Louisiana, in the late 1830s, was a place of contradictions and extremes. New Orleans thrived as one of America's wealthiest cities, its port bringing in sugar, cotton, and enslaved people by the thousands. The French and Spanish colonial influences still shaped the culture, the architecture, the very language spoken in the streets. Creole French mixed with English, Spanish, and African languages to create a linguistic tapestry unique to the region. The city's theaters hosted opera and ballet. Its restaurants served cuisine that rivaled Paris. Its ballrooms glittered with chandeliers imported from Europe. But beyond the city's gaslights and grand homes, beyond the carefully manicured gardens and the elegant façades, the plantation economy ruled with absolute authority. The parishes north of New Orleans, St. James, St. John the Baptist, and Ascension formed the heart of sugar country. These were not the sprawling cotton plantations of Mississippi or Alabama where enslaved people worked in relative isolation across vast acreages. Sugar cultivation required different labor, different timing, different brutality. The sugar cane had to be harvested and processed within a narrow window before the first frost could damage the crop. This meant that from October through December, the grinding season, every plantation became a factory running 24 hours a day. Enslaved people worked in shifts that stretched 18, 20, sometimes 22 hours. They cut cane in the fields under the November sun, hauled it to the sugar houses, fed it into the grinding mills, boiled the juice in massive kettles, stirred the crystallizing sugar, packed it into hogsheads for shipping. The machinery was dangerous. The mills could catch clothing, hair, limbs, pulling workers into the grinding rollers before anyone could react. The kettles of boiling sugar juice could splash, causing burns that went down to the bone. The exhaustion led to accidents, to mistakes, to deaths that were recorded in ledgers as simple losses of property calculated against the profit margin of the harvest. The mortality rate among enslaved people on Louisiana sugar plantations was the highest in the American South. Owners knew this. They calculated it into their business models. It was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to maintain a sustainable pace of labor. This was the world into which those strange children would be born, a world where human beings were reduced to units of production, where their bodies were not their own, where the law offered them no protection and no recourse. The parishes were densely populated compared to other plantation regions. Properties sat close together along the river, their boundaries often separated by nothing more than a line of cypress trees or a narrow bayou. The river was the highway, the lifeline, the connection between plantations. Steamboats moved up and down constantly carrying goods, mail, passengers, news. Information traveled quickly here. A birth on one plantation would be known on 3 others by the next morning. A death, a sale, a punishment, all became common knowledge almost immediately. This interconnectedness made the mystery all the more disturbing, because when the unusual births began, they didn't happen in isolation. They formed a pattern, and patterns meant intention. The first plantation to record such a birth was Bellemont, a mid-sized sugar operation owned by the Duchamp family. They'd held the land for 3 generations since the Spanish colonial period. The main house was built in the Creole style, raised on brick pillars to protect against flooding with wide galleries wrapping around both floors. Moss-draped oak trees lined the drive from the river road. Behind the main house, the sugar works sprawled the mill buoy. Elding, the boiling house, the curing sheds, the cooper, where barrels were made. Further back, beyond a screen of trees, sat the quarters. 2 rows of cabins facing each other across a dirt path. Each cabin housed multiple families, sometimes as many as 10 or 12 people in a single room. There was no privacy, no space, no comfort, just survival. The Duchamp family consisted of Monsieur Philippe Duchamp, his wife Celeste, and their 3 children. Philippe was 48 years old in 1837, a thin, nervous man who had inherited the plantation from his father and managed it with constant anxiety. He worried about crop yields, about sugar prices, about competition from Cuban imports, about the loans he'd taken to expand his operations. He worried about slave rebellions, about abolitionists, about the changing political climate that threatened the entire system his wealth depended on. His overseer, Vincent Habert, was 32 years old and had worked at Belmont for 6 years. Habert was unusual among overseers. He could read and write fluently in both French and English. He kept meticulous records. He had a reputation for being firm but not unnecessarily cruel, for maximizing productivity through organization rather than through terror. This made him valuable to Duchamp, who lacked the stomach for the violence that many plantation owners considered necessary. Habert lived in a small house between the main residence and the quarters, positioned so he could monitor both. He rose before dawn every day, made his rounds, assigned work details, tracked progress, recorded everything in his ledgers. He knew every enslaved person on the plantation by name, knew their skills, their weaknesses, their family connections. This knowledge was power, and Habert wielded it carefully. It was Habert who first noticed the anomaly in March of 1837, and it was Hirt who would spend the next 7 years trying to understand what it meant. The child was born just before dawn on March 14, 1837, delivered by an elderly enslaved midwife named Josephine, who had brought more than 200 babies into the world over her 60-some years. Josephine had been born in Sandang before the Revolution, before it became Haiti. She'd been brought to Louisiana as a young woman and had survived everything. The transition from French to American rule, multiple changes of ownership, the deaths of her own children, the endless grinding labor of the sugar harvest. She'd seen every complication, every variation, every tragedy that childbirth could bring. Breech births, stillbirths, mothers who bled out on the cabin floor, babies born too early to survive, twins tangled together, infections that turned to fever and death. She'd learned to keep her face neutral, to show no emotion, to simply do the work and move on to the next crisis. But when she cleaned the newborn girl and saw her features in the lamplight, she felt something she rarely experienced: genuine fear. The mother was a woman named Marie, dark-skinned, strong, 23 years old. She'd been born on Bellemont, had known no other life. Her mother had died in the sugar house when Marie was 12, caught by the grinding mill, her screams cut short as the machinery pulled her in. Marie had watched it happen. She'd been standing 10 feet away, unable to move, unable to help, unable to do anything but witness. After that, Marie had become quiet. She spoke only when necessary, kept her eyes down, did her work without complaint. She'd been paired with a man named Thomas when she was 18, a pairing arranged by Hebert to produce children who would become plantation property. Thomas was a field hand, strong and reliable, 25 years old. They lived together in one corner of a cabin they shared with 3 other families. Marie had given birth to 1 child already, a boy named Jack, who was now 4 years old. He looked like his parents, dark skin, dark eyes, tightly coiled hair. He was healthy, bright, already being trained to work in the fields. This second child should have looked the same. Every expectation, every understanding of heredity, every observation of how children resembled their parents suggested that this baby would have dark skin, dark eyes, dark hair. Instead, when Josephine wiped away the birth fluids and held the infant up to the lamp, she saw pale skin, hair so blonde it was almost white, and eyes the color of a clear winter sky. Josephine wrapped the child quickly, her mind racing. She'd heard stories, of course, passed down from older midwives. Stories that went back generations. Stories of children born looking different from their parents, explained away by distant ancestry, by bloodlines that carried hidden traits. The old women spoke of how African peoples had mixed with Arab traders, with Portuguese sailors, with the various peoples who had moved across the continent over centuries. Sometimes those distant mixtures would resurface, they said, producing a child with lighter skin or different features. But this was different. This wasn't a slightly lighter complexion or looser curl pattern. This child looked as though she'd been born to a Swedish immigrant, not to Marie. The features were completely European, the narrow nose, the thin lips, the bone structure of the face. When Marie saw her daughter, she didn't speak, she simply stared, her exhaustion replaced by something else, recognition perhaps, or resignation. Her hands shook as she took the baby, and Josephine saw tears begin to slide down her face. "Does she look like anyone you know?" Josephine asked quietly, a question that carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Marie's silence was answer enough. She held her daughter close, rocking slightly, and Josephine saw in her face a grief so profound it seemed to fill the small cabin. Thomas arrived an hour later, coming from the fields where he'd been working the night shift during grinding season. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the child, his face going blank with shock. "That's not mine," he said flatly. "She is yours," Marie whispered. "She is. Look at her and tell me that's my child. Thomas, please. Who was it?" His voice was rising now. "Dangerous. Who did you?" "No one," Marie said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, no one. I don't understand this. I don't understand." Josephine intervened, stepping between them. "This happens sometimes," she said, though she didn't believe it herself. "Old blood coming through, ancestors from long ago." Thomas stared at the baby, at Marie, at Josephine. Then he turned and walked out of the cabin without another word. By midday, everyone on Belmont knew about the birth. The news spread through the quarters like wildfire. People came to see for themselves, crowding into the cabin, staring at the impossible child. Some whispered about curses, about spirits, about punishments from God. Others were silent, their faces troubled, as though they understood something they couldn't or wouldn't speak aloud. By evening, the news had reached 2 neighboring plantations carried by enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, by traders who stopped at multiple landings along the river, by the invisible network of communication that existed beneath the surface of plantation society. By the end of the week, Vincent Hebert had been called to the main house to explain the situation to Monsieur Duchamp. Hebert walked up the Oakland Drive with a sense of dread. He'd already questioned Marie gently at first, then with increasing pressure. She'd insisted she'd been with no one but Thomas. She'd sworn it, even as tears streamed down her face, even as she held her strange-looking daughter. He'd questioned Thomas, who'd refused to accept the child as his own, who'd moved out of the cabin and requested reassignment to a different work crew. He'd questioned other enslaved people who lived in the same cabin who might have seen or heard something. No one had any information, or if they did, they weren't sharing it. Duchamp was pacing his study when Here arrived, his thin face pinched with worry. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. A portrait of Duchamp's father hung over the fireplace, stern and judgmental. "Sit down, Hare. Tell me what happened." Here sat in the chair across from Duchamp's desk and laid out the facts as he knew them. The birth, the child's appearance, Marie's insistence that she'd been with no one but Thomas, the lack of any evidence or testimony to suggest otherwise. "It's not possible," Duchamp said, resuming his pacing. "Thomas is the father. It's in the records. I have the breeding records right here." He pulled out a ledger, flipped through pages. Marie and Thomas paired in 1832. First child born 1833. This is the second. Thomas is the father. "Yes, sir," he replied carefully. "That's what the records show. But the child? I don't care what the child looks like," Duchamp interrupted, his voice sharp with anxiety. "There's an explanation. There must be mixed ancestry, perhaps, some distant relative. These things happen. Sir, I've seen mixed ancestry. This is different. This child looks completely European." Duchamp stopped pacing and stared at Hebert. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm simply reporting what I've observed. Because if you're suggesting that one of us," Duchamp couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too dangerous, too scandalous. "I'm not suggesting anything," Ert repeated. "I'm asking what you want me to do." Champ sat down heavily in his chair. He looked suddenly older, more tired. "Record the birth, note the unusual appearance, but the father of record remains Thomas. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "And Hibber, I don't want this discussed. Not with the other overseers, not with anyone. It's a private matter, an anomaly, nothing more." "Yes, sir." Herbert left the main house with a troubled mind. He understood Duchamp's position. Any suggestion that a white man had fathered a child with an enslaved woman would be scandalous, but it wouldn't be shocking. Such things happened, though they were rarely acknowledged openly. The real problem was the implication of force of violation because Marie insisted she'd been with no one but Thomas, which meant if the child wasn't Thomas's, then something had happened to Marie without her consent. And if that was true, if someone had violated an enslaved woman on Duchamp's property, it raised questions about security, about control, about the order that was supposed to govern plantation life. It suggested that someone had access to the quarters to the women without oversight or consequence. Hebert went back to his house and opened his personal journal separate from the official plantation records. He wrote down everything he knew about the birth, about Marie's testimony, about the child's appearance. He dated the entry carefully, March 14, 1837. He had no way of knowing that this entry would be the first of many, that he was documenting the beginning of something that would consume the next 7 years of his life. The child was named Claire. Marie tried to care for her, tried to love her, but the baby was a constant reminder of something Marie couldn't explain and couldn't escape. Thomas never acknowledged Claire as his daughter. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin where she lived, avoided even looking at the child when their paths crossed. The OT. Her enslaved people on Belmont were divided in their reactions. Some felt sympathy for Marie, understanding that something terrible had happened to her even if she couldn't or wouldn't speak of it. Others were suspicious, believing she must have been with someone, must have done something to bring this situation on herself. A few were frightened, sensing that Claire's existence meant something dangerous, something that threatened them all. Claire grew. She was a healthy baby, meeting all the normal milestones, but her appearance became more striking as she aged. Her hair grew in thick and blonde. Her eyes remained that startling blue. Her skin stayed pale, burning easily in the Louisiana sun. By the time she was 6 months old, she looked like a Nordic child who had somehow ended up in the quarters of a Louisiana plantation. The contrast between her appearance and her surroundings was jarring, disturbing, impossible to ignore. And then 14 months after Claire's birth, it happened again. The second birth occurred on a plantation called Riverside, 6 miles upriver from Belmont. Riverside was larger than Belmont, with more acreage under cultivation and a larger enslaved population. The owner was a man named Etienne Broussard, 55 years old, a second-generation Louisiana planter, whose family had made their fortune in the sugar trade. Broussard was known for running a profitable operation. He was also known for his temper, for his willingness to use violence to maintain control, for his belief that enslaved people needed to be kept in a state of fear to remain productive. His overseer, a man named Gideon Frost, shared this philosophy. Frost was 40 years old, a transplant from Virginia who had come to Louisiana seeking opportunity. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. He carried a whip coiled at his belt and wasn't afraid to use it. The enslaved P.O. Plea at Riverside feared him, and Frost believed that fear was the foundation of good management. The mother was a woman named Deline, 20 years old, who worked in the main house as a lairess. She'd been selected for this position because of her quiet demeanor, her efficiency, her ability to remain invisible. House servants had to master this skill, the ability to be present but not noticed, to move through rooms without drawing attention, to hear conversations without appearing to listen. Deline had been born on a plantation in the Natchez district and sold to Riverside when she was 15. The sale had separated her from her mother and two younger siblings. She'd never seen them again. This loss had hollowed her out, left her with a kind of emptiness that she filled with work, with routine, with the small comforts she could find, a moment of rest, a full meal, the absence of pain. She'd been paired with a field hand named Samuel, 22 years old, strong and quiet. They lived together in the quarters, shared a space in one of the cabins. Their relationship was cordial but not close. They were two people thrown together by someone else's decision, making the best of circumstances neither had chosen. When Deline discovered she was pregnant, she felt a mix of emotions. Fear, because pregnancy meant vulnerability, meant pain, meant the possibility of death, but also a small, fragile hope. A child would be someone to love, someone who belonged to her, at least for a little while before. The plantation claimed that child too. The pregnancy progressed normally. Deline continued her work in the laundry, hauling water, scrubbing clothes, hanging them to dry in the humid air. As her belly grew, the work became harder, but she didn't complain. Complaining led to punishment. She gave birth in May of 1838, attended by the plantation midwife, a woman named Ruth. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. But finally, the baby was born. A boy, healthy, crying lustily. Ruth cleaned the infant and then stopped, her hands frozen, her face going pale. "What is it?" Deline asked, exhausted, reaching for her son. "What's wrong?" Ruth didn't answer. She simply handed the baby to Delphine and stepped back, her expression troubled. Deline looked down at her son and felt the world tilt. The baby had blonde hair, blue eyes, and skin so pale it seemed translucent. He looked nothing like her, nothing like Samuel, nothing like anyone in her family. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't. This can't." "Who's the father?" Ruth asked quietly. "Samuel." "Samuel is the father. I haven't been with anyone else. I swear it." "Then how do you explain this child?" "I can't," Deline said, tears beginning to fall. "I can't explain it." Samuel was brought from the fields to see his son. His reaction was immediate and angry. He stared at the baby, at Deline, and his face hardened. "You've been with someone," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I haven't, Samuel. I swear, don't lie to me. Look at him. That's not my child. He is. He has to be. I haven't been with anyone else." "Then who? Who did this?" "I don't know," Deline sobbed. "I don't know." Samuel left the cabin and didn't return. He requested a transfer to a different work crew, to a different cabin. He never acknowledged the boy as his son. Gideon Frost heard about the birth within hours. He came to the quarters, pushed into the cabin where Delphine lay recovering, and stared at the baby with a mixture of shock and anger. "Who's the father?" he demanded. "Samuel," Deline whispered. "That's not Samuel's child. Look at it. I haven't been with anyone else. You're lying. I'm not. I swear on my life I'm not lying. Frost questioned her for an hour, his voice growing harsher, his threats more explicit. But Deline's store never changed. She'd been with no one but Samuel. She couldn't explain the child's appearance. She didn't understand what had happened. Finally, Frost gave up. He reported the situation to Brassard, who reacted with fury. He accused Frost of not maintaining proper control, of allowing enslaved people to move freely, of failing in his duties. Frost defended himself, insisting that he ran a tight operation, that there was no way an outsider could have accessed the quarters without being noticed. The argument went in circles. Finally, Brassard ordered the birth recorded with Samuel as the father of record, despite the obvious impossibility. The matter was to be closed, not discussed, forgotten. The baby was named Jong, and like Claire before him, he was a living impossibility, a child who shouldn't exist. When news of Jong's birth reached Belmont, Vincent Heber felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random genetic variation. This was something else, something deliberate, something that was happening across multiple plantations. He pulled out his personal journal and made a new entry, carefully noting the date of Jean's birth, the plantation where it occurred, the mother's name, the circumstances. He placed this entry next to his notes about Claire's birth and stared at the two entries, looking for connections. Both mothers had been working in or near the main houses of their respective plantations. Marie had been called up from the fields to help with cleaning during a period when Bellamont's regular house staff was short-handed. Delphine already worked in the house, but she'd been assigned to additional duties in the month before her pregnancy, including night work, cleaning and preparing rooms after the family had retired. Here felt his pulse quicken. This was a pattern, a connection. It might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. He began making inquiries, carefully, quietly. He spoke to traders who moved between plantations, asking casual questions about births, about unusual occurrences, about gossip they might have heard. He questioned enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, listening to their conversations, noting details, and he waited because if his suspicions were correct, if this was a pattern rather than a coincidence, then it would happen again. He was right. Over the next 2 years, 3 more children were born with the same impossible features. Each birth followed the same pattern: an enslaved mother with dark features, a recorded father who matched her appearance, and a child who looked nothing like either parent. The third child was born at a plantation called Oakmont in November of 1838. The mother was a woman named Isabel, 25 years old, who worked in the main house as a cook's assistant. The baby was a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. Isabel insisted she'd been with no one but her partner, a man named Gabriel. No one believed her, but no one could prove otherwise. The fourth child was born at a plantation called St. Clair in March of 1839. The mother was a woman named Terz, 19 years old, who had been brought up from the quarters to help serve at a dinner party 2 months before her pregnancy began. The baby was a boy with the same distinctive features. Terz's partner, a man named Antoine, refused to acknowledge the child. The fifth child was born at a plantation called Magnolia Grove in September of 1839. The mother was a woman named Pauline, 22 years old, who worked in the laundry. She'd been called to the main house to help with cleaning during a period when the regular staff was occupied with other duties. Her baby was a girl, blonde and blue-eyed. Her partner, a man named Louis, left her after the birth. Vincent Heber documented each birth in his private journal. He noted the dates, the plantations, the mothers' names, their work assignments. He created a map marking each location where a birth had occurred. The plantations were spread across 3 parishes, but all were within a 15-mile radius along the Mississippi River. He also noted something else, something that had taken him months to piece together, a name that appeared in the background of each situation, never prominently, never obviously, but always there. Dr. Marcus Levine. Levine was a physician, 42 years old, unmarried, respected throughout the parishes. He'd been born in Louisiana to a French father and a Creole mother. He'd been sent to Paris to study medicine at the age of 18, had spent 8 years there and had returned to Louisiana in 1825 to establish his practice. He was known for his skill, particularly in treating fevers and infections that were common in the humid Louisiana climate. He was also known for his discretion, his willingness to treat delicate matters without gossip, his ability to keep secrets. This made him popular among the planter families who valued privacy above almost everything else. Levine served several plantations as their primary doctor, traveling between them as needed. He treated the planter families for their various ailments, and he also treated enslaved people when their value as property justified the expense. A skilled worker with a broken bone, a pregnant woman whose child represented future property, a house servant whose training made them valuable. These were worth the cost of medical care. Levine was also known for his distinctive appearance. He was tall and thin with pale blonde hair that he wore longer than was fashionable and striking blue eyes that seemed to see through people. He dressed well, but not ostentatiously, in dark suits that emphasized his pale coloring. He moved with a kind of deliberate grace, speaking softly, never raising his voice, always maintaining perfect control. Heba had met Levine several times over the years. The doctor had been called to Belmont to treat Madame Duchamp for a fever, to set a broken arm for a field hand who'd been injured during harvest, to attend to various minor ailments. He had found him professional, competent, and oddly cold. There was something about Levine that made Heba uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. Now reviewing his notes, Hirt saw the pattern. Levine had been present at or near each plantation during the crucial time periods before the pregnancies began. He'd attended a social gathering at Belmont in December of 1836, 3 months before Marie conceived. He'd been called to Riverside to treat Madame Broussard for a respiratory infection in February of 1838, 3 months before Deline conceived. He'd delivered a baby for the owner's wife at Oakmont in August of 1838, 3 months before Isabel conceived. He'd examined an injured worker at St. Clair in December of 1838, 3 months before TZ conceived. He'd attended a dinner party at Magnolia Grove in June of 1839, 3 months before Pauline conceived. Always there, always in the background, always with access. His hands shook as he made these connections. He reviewed his notes again and again, checking dates, cross-referencing visits, looking for any mistake in his reasoning. But the pattern held. It was too precise to be coincidence, but having a suspicion and proving it were entirely different matters. Hirt had no direct evidence, no witnesses, no confession. He had only a pattern, a series of coincidences that seemed too precise to be accidental. He needed to speak to the women. If Levine was responsible, then the women would know. They might not be able to speak openly, might not be willing to accuse a white man, especially a respected doctor. But they would know. Hebert started with Marie since she was on his own plantation. He found her in the fields one afternoon working with a hoe, her daughter Claire strapped to her back in a cloth sling. Claire was now 2 years old, her blonde hair bright in the sun. "Marie," Hebert said quietly, approaching her, "I need to speak with you." Marie looked up, her face guarded. "Yes, sir. About Claire? About her father?" Marie's expression closed completely. "Thomas is her father, sir. That's what the records say. Marie, I know that's not true, and I think you know it too." "I don't know what you mean, sir. I think someone hurt you, someone you couldn't refuse. Someone who had power over you." Marie was silent for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Even if that were true, sir, what difference would it make? I'm property. Property can't be hurt. Property can't refuse. Property has no rights." "Marie, I have nothing more to say, sir. Thomas is Claire's father. That's what the records show." She turned back to her work, and Hirt knew he would get nothing more from her. The wall she'd built around this secret was impenetrable. He tried with the other women, traveling to the other plantations on various pretexts, finding opportunities to speak with Delphine, with Isabel, with TZ, with Pauline. Each conversation went the same way. The women insisted they'd been with no one but their recorded partners. They had nothing more to say. The wall was always there, impenetrable. He understood. These women had no legal standing, no rights, no recourse. If they accused a white man, especially a respected doctor, they would not be believed. They would be punished for lying, for making trouble, for threatening the social order. Their children might be sold away. Their lives might become even more unbearable than they already were. Silence was their only protection, however inadequate. Heard DC. Dad, he needed to take his findings to someone with more authority, someone who might actually be able to act on the information. He chose Judge Armand Thibault, a respected figure in St. James Parish. Thibault was 60 years old, a lawyer who had been appointed to the bench 15 years earlier. He was known for his fairness within the constraints of the system, for his willingness to address difficult matters, for his intelligence and his integrity. Requested a meeting and Thibault agreed to see him. They met in Thibault's office in the parish courthouse, a humid afternoon in July 1840. The office was lined with law books and papers covered every surface. Thibault sat behind his desk, a large man with gray hair and shrewd eyes. Herbert laid out his evidence carefully. He showed Thibault his map with the plantations marked. He showed him his timeline with the dates of the births and the dates of Levine's visits. He explained the pattern, the connection, the impossibility of coincidence. Thibault listened in silence, his expression growing darker as he spoke. When Heer finished, Thibault sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is a serious accusation," Thibault said finally. "I know, sir. That's why I've brought it to you. Do you have any direct evidence? Any testimony from the women?" "No, sir, they won't speak or can't speak. I've tried." Thibault stood and walked to his window, looking out at the street below. The courthouse was in the center of the parish seat, a small town that served the surrounding plantations. The street was busy with afternoon traffic, wagons, horses, people going about their business. "You understand what you're suggesting," Thibault said, his back still to Heber. "Dr. Levine is a respected member of this community. His family has been here for generations. His father was a prominent merchant. His mother came from one of the old Creole families. To accuse him of this, without solid proof, would be devastating. It would destroy his reputation, his practice, his life. I understand, sir, but the children exist. The pattern exists. 5 children in 2 years, all with the same impossible features, all born to mothers who had contact with Dr. Levine in the months before conception. Patterns can be coincidence. 5 times, sir, across 5 plantations, all within 2 years and all connected to one man." Thibault turned back to face Heber. "Even if you're right, even if Dr. Levine is responsible, what law has he broken? You said yourself that the women won't testify. Without their testimony, there's no case. And even with their testimony," he trailed off. And Hirt understood what he wasn't saying. Even with testimony, enslaved women had no legal standing. Their word would not be taken over that of a white man, especially a respected doctor. The law didn't recognize what had been done to them as a crime. "So there's nothing to be done?" he but asked, hearing the bitterness in his own voice. "I didn't say that," Thibault replied. "I'll make inquiries discreetly. I'll speak to some of the plantation owners, ask questions, see what I can learn. But I want you to stop your investigation. If word of this spreads, if accusations start flying without proof, it will cause panic and damage that we may not be able to contain. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. Go back to Bellomo. Say nothing to anyone. Let me handle this." Ebert left the courthouse with a mixture of relief and frustration. He'd done what he could. The matter was now in official hands, but he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would come of it, that the truth would be buried under the weight of reputation and social standing. He was right. Judge Thibault did make inquiries, but they were so discreet as to be nearly invisible. He spoke to 3 of the plantation owners privately in carefully arranged meetings that left no public record. He asked vague questions about Dr. Levine's visits, about unusual occurrences, about the births of the distinctive-looking children. The responses were uniformly defensive. The plantation owners saw the questions as threats to their property values, their reputations, their social standing. They insisted there was nothing unusual, nothing that required investigation. The children were anomalies, genetic quirks, nothing more. Otten Broussard, the owner of Riverside, was particularly hostile. He met with Thibault in his study, a room dominated by a massive desk and portraits of his ancestors. "Are you suggesting that I don't know what happens on my own property?" Broussard demanded, his face flushed with anger. "That I can't control my own people? This is insulting, Armand, deeply insulting." "I'm not suggesting anything of the kind," Thibault replied calmly. "I'm simply following up on some concerns that have been brought to my attention." "Concerns? What concerns?" "That some babies were born with light kin. That happens sometimes. Mixed ancestry, distant bloodlines, it's not unusual. 5 babies in 2 years, Etienne. All on different plantations, all with the same distinctive features. So that's coincidence. Nothing more. And all the mothers had contact with Dr. Levine in the months before conception." Broussard's face went from flushed to pale. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. Dr. Levine is a respected physician. He's treated my family for years. He's above reproach. I'm sure he is. But the pattern? There is no pattern," Broussard interrupted. "There are coincidences, and I won't have you spreading rumors that could damage a good man's reputation or mine. Do you understand?" Thibault understood. He understood that Broussard was more concerned about scandal than about truth, more worried about property values than about justice. He understood that pushing further would make enemies of powerful men, would damage his own position, would accomplish nothing. The other plantation owners gave similar responses. They were defensive, hostile, unwilling to consider that something wrong might have happened on their properties. To admit that would be to admit failure of control, failure of oversight, failure of the system itself. Within 2 weeks, Thibault sent word to Eber that the investigation was closed. There was insufficient evidence to proceed. The matter was to be dropped. Eber received the news with bitter resignation. He'd expected it, but the confirmation still stung. He filed his notes away, locked them in his desk, and tried to return to his normal duties. But the births didn't stop. In November 1840, another child was born at a plantation called Sweetwater, 8 miles south of Belle. The plantation was smaller than most, specializing in indigo rather than sugar. The owner was a widow named Madame Hebert, no relation to Vincent, who ran the operation with the help of her son. The mother was a woman named Cecile, 24 years old, who worked in the sugar house during grinding season and in the fields the rest of the year. The baby was a boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. Cecile's partner, a man named Joseph, refused to acknowledge the child. Dr. Levine had been called to Sweetwater 3 months earlier to treat Madame Heb's son for a fever. He'd stayed for 2 days, sleeping in a guest room, taking his meals with the family. In March 1841, another birth at Riverside. The mother was a different woman this time, a field hand named Let, 21 years old. The baby was a girl with the same distinctive features. Lizette's partner, a man named Michel, left her after the birth. Dr. Levine had attended a social gathering at Riverside in December of 1840. In August 1841, another birth at Oakmont. The mother was a woman named Margot, 23 years old, who worked in the main house. The baby was a boy. Margot's partner, a man named Henri, refused to speak to her after the birth. Dr. Levine had been called to Oakmont to treat an injured field hand in May of 1841. In January 1842, another birth at a new plantation, Cypress Point, 10 miles north of Belle. The mother was a woman named Adele, 20 years old. The baby was a girl. Adele's partner, a man named Francois, requested a transfer to a different plantation. Dr. Levine had attended a dinner party at Cypress Point in October of 1841. The pattern continued, relentless and undeniable. Vincent Hebert documented each birth in his private journal. Even though he'd been told to stop his investigation, he couldn't let it go. The pattern was too clear, too deliberate. 9 children now, all with the same impossible features, all connected to Dr. Levine. And with each new birth, the whispers grew louder. The enslaved community knew something was wrong. They couldn't speak openly, couldn't accuse, couldn't demand justice, but they knew, and they began to protect themselves. Women started refusing assignments to the main houses. They claimed illness, injury, any excuse to avoid being called up from the quarters. When pressed, they became sullen, resistant, uncooperative. Overseers noticed the resistance and responded with punishment. Women were whipped for refusing work assignments, for claiming false illness, for insubordination, but the resistance continued. The women seemed willing to accept punishment rather than risk being called to the main houses. This created problems for the plantation operations. House servants were necessary for the smooth functioning of the main houses. Laundry had to be done, meals had to be prepared, rooms had to be cleaned. When women refused these assignments, the work fell to others, creating resentment and disruption. Tension on the plantations became palpable. Productivity dropped. Small acts of rebellion increased, tools broken, work slowed, minor acts of sabotage that couldn't be directly traced but accumulated into significant disruption. The plantation owners blamed their overseers for losing control. The overseers blamed the enslaved workers for being lazy and rebellious. No one wanted to acknowledge the real cause of the unrest except Vincent Hebert. He saw what was happening, understood the fear that drove it. The women were protecting themselves the only way they could through resistance and refusal, even at the cost of punishment. And he made a decision that would change everything. He began documenting the births again, but this time he didn't keep the information to himself. He shared it carefully and selectively with other overseers, with traders, with anyone who might listen. He created copies of his map, his timeline, his evidence connecting Dr. Levine to each incident. He knew it was dangerous. He knew he was risking his position, possibly his life, but he couldn't stay silent anymore. The pattern was too clear, the injustice too great, the suffering too profound. The information spread slowly at first, then faster. Overseers talked to each other, comparing notes, sharing stories. Traders carried the information from plantation to plantation, from parish to parish. The whispers became conversations. The conversations became discussions. By the summer of 1842, the story was known throughout the 3 parishes. It was discussed in hushed conversations in plantation offices, in letters between plantation owners, in the careful language of people who understood they were approaching something explosive. The plantation owners tried to suppress the story, but it was too late. Too many people knew. The scandal was becoming public knowledge. And finally, inevitably, the story reached Dr. Marcus Levine himself. Levine's response was not what anyone expected. He didn't deny the accusations. He didn't flee. He didn't show any sign of shame or fear. Instead, he called a meeting in September 1842. He sent formal invitations to the owners of all the affected plantations, asking them to gather at his home on a Thursday evening. He also invited Judge Thibault, several other prominent citizens, and surprisingly, Vincent Hebe. The invitations were polite but firm. Levine wrote that he understood there had been questions about certain matters, and he wished to address these questions directly and comprehensively. He requested the courtesy of a hearing before any further action was taken. The plantation owners were caught off guard. The invitation itself was unusual, almost unprecedented, but they agreed to attend, curious about what Levine might say, how he might defend himself. Hebert received his invitation with a sense of dread. He didn't know what Levine was planning, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The meeting took place on a Thursday evening, September 15, 1842. The air was thick with humidity and the threat of rain. 15 men gathered at Levine's home, a modest but well-appointed house on the outskirts of the parish seat. The house was built in the American style rather than Creole, with a symmetrical facade and a central hallway. Levine greeted each guest personally as they arrived, shaking hands, making small talk, playing the role of gracious host. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes clear and steady. He showed no sign of nervousness or concern. When all the guests had arrived, Levine led them to his parlor, a room furnished with comfortable chairs arranged in a semicircle. A sideboard held decanters of whiskey and brandy, glasses, cigars. Levine invited the men to help themselves, to make tea, themselves comfortable. The atmosphere was surreal. It felt like a social gathering, not a confrontation. The men sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting to hear what the doctor had to say. Levine stood before them, calm and composed. He held a glass of brandy in one hand, and he took a small sip before beginning to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I understand there have been questions about certain births that have occurred over the past several years, questions about the appearance of these children, about their parentage, about my possible involvement." The room was absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed on Levine. "I want to address these questions directly and honestly," Levine continued. "I believe that clarity is preferable to rumor, that truth is preferable to speculation. So let me be clear. Yes, I am the father of these children, all of them." The silence shattered into chaos. Men shouted, stood, demanded explanations. Judge T-Bull called for order, his voice barely audible over the uproar. Brassard was on his feet, his face purple with rage. Duchamp looked as though he might faint. Levine waited, patient, sipping his brandy until the room quieted again. It took several minutes. "I understand your shock," Levine said when he could be heard again. "But before you judge me, I ask that you hear my explanation. What I have done with purpose and with what I believe to be sound reasoning." "Sound reasoning?" Brassard shouted. "You violated." "I have conducted an experiment," Levine interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise, "a scientific experiment that I believe has profound implications for our understanding of human heredity and racial characteristics." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different, confused, horrified. Levine walked to a desk in the corner of the room and retrieved a leather-bound journal. He held it up so everyone could see. "For the past 7 years," he said, "I have been studying the question of racial inheritance. Specifically, I wanted to understand whether the physical characteristics we associate with race are immutable or whether they can be altered through selective breeding." He opened the journal, showing pages filled with notes, diagrams, measurements, observations. The handwriting was neat and precise, the work of someone who took pride in documentation. "I theorized," Levine continued, "that by introducing European genetic material into the African population, I could produce offspring that displayed European features. The children born over these years have confirmed my hypothesis. Regardless of the mother's appearance, my genetic contribution has dominated, producing children with blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin." Vincent Heber felt physically ill. Around him, other men showed similar reactions: pale faces, clenched jaws, hands gripping chair arms. The casual way Levine spoke about human beings, about women, about children, was more disturbing than any rage or justification would have been. "You're talking about human beings," T-Bolt said, his voice shaking. "Not livestock, not experimental subjects. Human beings." "Am I?" Levine asked, turning to face the judge. His expression was genuinely curious, as though this were an interesting philosophical question. "The law of this state says otherwise, Judge T-Bolt. The law says these women are property. The law says their children are property. I have violated no statute, broken no law. I have simply used available resources to pursue scientific knowledge." "You've committed rape," Herbert said, the word hanging in the air like poison multiple times against women who had no ability to refuse you, no ability to protect themselves. Levine turned to him, his expression unchanged. "Rape is a crime committed against persons, Mr. Hebert. These women are not legally persons. They are property. I no more committed rape than a farmer commits rape when he breeds his cattle. The law is quite clear on this point. The logic was monstrous, but it was also legally sound. Louisiana law in 1842 did not recognize enslaved people as having the legal standing to be victims of rape. They were property, and property could not be raped. The law protected property owners from theft or damage to their property, but it did not protect the property itself from the actions of others. Several of the plantation owners looked uncomfortable, but none spoke up to challenge Levine's reasoning, because to do so would be to challenge the entire legal and social structure that supported their way of life. If enslaved people were persons with rights, then the entire system of slavery became untenable. Why? Duchamp asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Why do this? What did you hope to gain? Knowledge, Levine replied simply. Understanding. I wanted to prove that racial characteristics are not fixed, that they can be manipulated through selective breeding. This has implications for everything, for slavery, for colonization, for the future of human civilization. He walked back to the center of the room, his journal still in his hand. Consider the possibilities, he said, his voice taking on an almost evangelical quality. If we can alter racial traits through selective breeding, we can reshape entire populations. We can create workers ideally suited to specific climates and tasks. We can eliminate undesirable characteristics and enhance desirable ones. We can engineer the future of humanity itself. You're insane, someone muttered. I'm a scientist, Levine corrected, and my experiment has been successful. The children exist. The evidence is undeniable. I have proven that European traits dominate African traits in mixed offspring. This is valuable knowledge, gentlemen. Knowledge that could be used to advance our understanding of human biology, of heredity, of the very nature of race itself. Judge Thibault stood, his face flushed with anger and something else, disgust perhaps, or horror at what he was hearing. Dr. Levine, he said, his voice hard. Regardless of the legal technicalities, what you've done is morally reprehensible. You've caused immense suffering to women who had no ability to refuse you. You've destroyed families. You've disrupted multiple plantations. You've created a scandal that will damage this entire region. I've created knowledge, Levine replied calmly. What you do with that knowledge is your concern, not mine. I've documented everything in this journal and in others, my methods, my observations, my conclusions. This information will be valuable to future scientists, to future generations. You will leave this parish, Thibault said. You will cease your practice here, sell your property, and go. If you refuse, I will find a way to bring charges. Legal technicalities be damned. I will make your life here impossible. Levine smiled slightly, and the smile was somehow more disturbing than anything else he'd said. I've already made arrangements to leave, Judge Thibault. My work here is complete. I've gathered sufficient data. I'm relocating to Texas, where I plan to continue my research on a larger scale. The frontier offers opportunities that are not available in more settled regions. Get out, Brassard said, his voice shaking with rage. Get out of this parish. Get out of Louisiana. And if I ever see you again, I'll kill you myself. Levine set down his brandy glass and inclined his head slightly, as though accepting a compliment. I'll be gone within the week, he said. Thank you for coming, gentlemen. I thought it important that you understand the truth of what has occurred. Rumors and speculation serve no one. The meeting dissolved into angry arguments, threats, and recriminations. But in the end, there was nothing anyone could do. Levine had broken no law. He could not be prosecuted, could not be punished through official channels. The system that should have protected the women he'd violated had instead protected him. Within 2 weeks he was gone. His house was sold to a merchant from New Orleans. His practice was transferred to another doctor. His furniture, his books, his personal effects were packed and shipped. He vanished into the expanding American frontier, taking his journals, his data, and his monstrous certainty with him. The aftermath of Levine's revelation spread through the parishes like a fever. The plantation owners tried to suppress the story, but it was too late. Too many people knew. The scandal became common knowledge discussed in New Orleans parlors, in riverboat saloons, in the careful letters that passed between planter families across Louisiana and beyond. The children remained, of course, 13 of them by the time Lavigne left, ranging in age from newborn to 5 years old. They grew up in the quarters, marked by their appearance, living proof of what had been done to their mothers. The mothers struggled with their children in different ways. Some, like Marie, tried to love these children despite everything. Marie held Claire close, sang to her, protected her as best she could, but there was always a distance, a wall that Marie couldn't quite break through. Every time she looked at Claire, she saw the violation, the helplessness, the night that had changed everything. Others couldn't bear to look at their children. Deline at Riverside became withdrawn and silent after John's birth. She cared for him mechanically, feeding him, keeping him clean, but showing no affection. When Jean reached for her, he would turn away. When he cried, she would hand him to another woman to comfort. The children sensed this rejection. Even as infants, they grew up knowing they were different, knowing they were unwanted, knowing their very existence caused pain. The fathers, the men who had been recorded as fathers, the men who had been partners to these women, reacted with anger and abandonment. Thomas never acknowledged Claire. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin where she lived, avoided even looking at the child when their paths crossed. Eventually he requested a transfer to another plantation, and Duchamp granted it, glad to be rid of a source of tension. Samuel at Riverside did the same. So did Gabriel, Antoine, Louis, Joseph, Michel, Henri, Francois, and the others. These men had been paired with these women by their owners, forced into relationships they hadn't chosen, but they'd made lives together, found small comforts in companionship. The births destroyed those fragile connections. The women were left alone, raising children who looked nothing like them, children who were constant reminders of violation and powerlessness. The enslaved community was divided in its response. Some people felt sympathy for the mothers, understanding that something terrible had happened to them. They helped when they could, watching the strange-looking children, sharing food, offering what comfort was possible. Others were suspicious or hostile. They believed the mothers must have done something to bring this on themselves, must have been willing participants. They whispered about the women, spread rumors, shunned them. The children grew up in this atmosphere of suspicion and division. They were neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, existing in a liminal space within the quarters. As they got older, their appearance became even more striking. By the time Claire was 5 years old, she looked like a Swedish child who had somehow ended up on a Louisiana plantation. Her hair was long and blonde, her eyes that startling blue, her skin pale and prone to burning. She stood out among the other children like a candle in darkness. The same was true for all of Lavigne's children. They were beautiful in a conventional European sense, and this beauty made them valuable in a specific way. As they grew older, some were sold to traders who specialized in what were euphemistically called fancy girls, enslaved women with light skin who were sold for sexual exploitation. The boys were sometimes kept as house servants, their appearance making them suitable for positions where they would be seen by visitors. This was another layer of horror. Lavigne's experiment had not only violated the mothers but had also created children who would be exploited because of their appearance, because of the very features that marked them as different. Vincent Hare continued as overseer at Belmont for 3 more years after Lavigne's departure, but he found it increasingly difficult to continue in his position. Every day he saw Claire growing up, saw Marie's pain, saw the evidence of a crime that had no legal name and no possibility of justice. In 1845, he resigned his position and moved to New Orleans. He found work as a clerk in a shipping office, a job that paid less but allowed him to sleep at night. He took his journals with him, the careful documentation of everything that had happened. Years later, in 1867, after the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished, H.E. donated his journals to a historical society. He wrote a cover letter explaining what the documents contained, why he'd kept them, what they represented. These records, he wrote, document a crime that was not legally a crime, a violation that was not legally a violation, suffering that was not legally suffering. They show a system designed to treat human beings as property created conditions where the most monstrous acts could be committed without consequence. I kept these records because I believed that someday someone would want to know the truth, that someday the truth would matter. The journals were filed away in an archive, rarely examined, a testament to a crime that was never officially acknowledged. Judge Thibault tried to pursue legal action against Levine, but every attorney he consulted gave him the same answer.